Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Nice to have you here. My name's Amanda McMullen. I'm the president and CEO of the Whaling Museum. And we are so pleased that you're joining us here tonight for an unfinished project, Reflections on the Promises of the Revolution of the Nation's 250th. We're going to begin our program tonight. Well, first, let me raise your hands if you've seen some of Ken Burns' episode already. Okay. You guys are experts. You're experts. That's great. As you know, the program tonight, we're going to open it up with about a 30-minute segment of Ken Burns' incredible documentary, The American Revolution, and that's thanks to our partnership with PBS, good friends. Following that, you're in for a real treat. We've got a dynamic discussion that will take place thanks to our panelists, Naomi Slipp, the Chief Curator and Director of Museum Learning at the Whaling Museum. Woo. Lee Blake, extraordinary educator, historian, and president of the New Bedford Historical Society. Thank you, Lee. And we're so thrilled to have Donika Kelly here, celebrated poet, author of The Natural Order of Things, assistant professor of English at the University of Iowa, and National Book Awardee. Thank you, Donika, for being here. At the very end, after the panel conversation, of course, we're going to have some light refreshments and hope that you'll also take a little skip through the second floor to check out our American Revolution exhibition entitled Forging Independence, Building a Nation. We also are really thrilled that we're going to have copies of Donika's new publication, The Natural Order of Things, for sale. And Donika is going to make herself available for signing copies of the book, so that's a real treat as well. Finally, I always say this, at the Whaling Museum, every single year, more than half of our public programs are totally free. And not just virtual, free and in person. We can only do this through the generous support of our community and our supporters and our donors. Tonight is made possible by the donations and support from the William M. Wood Foundation and Christina Bascom, so please give them a round of applause. And without further ado, enjoy Ken Burns' The American Revolution.
All right, here we are. Can you hear me okay? That was a good warm-up for us here. So good evening, and welcome to the panel discussion, an unfinished project that builds off the screening you just enjoyed of excerpts from Ken Burns' recent documentary series on Voices of the American Revolution, and considers the recently opened exhibition at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, Forging Independence, Building a Nation, the promises and potentialities embedded in the revolution and their connections to today. My name is Naomi Slipp, and I am Chief Curator and Director of Museum Learning at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It's my pleasure to introduce my fellow panelists, Lee Blake, who Amanda mentioned is president of the New Bedford Historical Society, among many other extraordinary accolades, and Donika Kelly, a celebrated poet and professor at the University of Iowa. So we're each going to come up and speak for about 10 minutes on some of the threads that carried through this excerpt of Ken Burns' series and some of the stories of individual lives that relate to this area, but also, I think, to today. After that, we'll sit together in conversation. We'll open up the floor for questions, and then this will be followed by a light reception, a book signing, and an opportunity to visit the exhibit upstairs. So I'm going to jump in and introduce you to the exhibition. So to begin, Forging Independence, Building a Nation is an exhibit that came together around three important pillars. First, to share stories about the region and its inhabitants between 1760 and 1820, a period roughly preceding the War for Independence, and then the decades that followed right after. The second pillar was to make connections between larger national events and local histories, and to center, whenever possible, the experiences of individuals from broad backgrounds during decades of tremendous change and extraordinary uncertainty. As we define in the introduction to the exhibition, during this period, in the span of a single lifetime, right, 1760 to 1820, if we think about the extraordinary number of events that happened so quickly, one upon the next, that's a single lifetime. We aim to make connections between these stories, especially looking at southern Massachusetts, when this region and those individuals living here went from being British colonial subjects to new Americans. That transition was neither easy nor equal, as we've just been reminded in the film. Neighbors and communities in this area, as across the colonies, were caught up in a chaotic period of revolt and nation formation. Individuals held different political allegiances, belief systems, and social relations, and conflicts arose about the best paths forward. The exhibition thinks about revolutionary events, historical figures, and also how nation building itself could test the limits of liberty. And words like patriotism, freedom, citizenship, and justice embodied concepts that were often more aspiration than action. An individual's role in these actions and the nation building that came after was often contested and based on identity markers like class, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and citizenship. So, as the screen up here says, who got to decide what America would become? And how was that negotiation managed in this region? What ideas and tenets became pillars of that era? How are their legacies felt today? And what complications or tensions arose in that space of negotiation? And the questions that we sort of end with in the introduction to the exhibition, these very questions, the promises, failures, or legacies of that negotiation, the continuation of this project of nation building that we live in and experience today, that shapes us and is shaped by us, is fundamentally important to understanding our history in the past and reflecting on our moments in the present. And it's useful to recognize the very unfixedness of much of the revolutionary moment, the uncertainties, the ambiguities, the contradictions between what was written and what was lived. As human beings, I think we like to essentialize and assert a sort of fixity to historical actors, events, and documents. But as the exhibition hopefully makes clear, nothing was ever certain, and very little came out of the period fully formed. Instead, America was and is a nation always in a state of becoming, aspiring, and evolving. It is messy, contradictory, often deeply unfair, and sometimes challenging. So I'm going to tell this story tonight of the exhibition in 3 chapters, highlighting the experiences of everyday individuals and the ways that revolution touched them. So chapter 1, this is kind of a top-level overview of the exhibition, but I do hope you'll be able to go upstairs and see it in more depth. Chapter 1 is New Bedford Connections. So by 1765, the name of this region, which at the time was known as Dartmouth, covered this whole area, about 180 square miles, and had over 4,500 residents. British colonial subjects in the region lived on farms and in small villages, most centered on the Acushnet River, around Buzzards Bay, and along the coastlines. Their daily lives reflected the culture of the British Empire, and many of them also were members of the Quaker faith, the dominant religion in the region at the time. During the period of the 1760s, passage of a number of acts by the British government, including the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, placed tariffs on many common items made in Britain and imported to the colonies, including sugar, coffee, textiles, paper goods, and many other things. And this region was deeply involved in trade with Britain and other parts of the British Empire, including the Indies or the Caribbean. And there was quite a lot of maritime activity that happened here, so that the impacts of those taxation acts across Massachusetts, but in this region, had pretty dramatic effects. Indeed, the village, not too far from where we are seated now, had its earliest shipyard established around 1760. And in that year, the Quaker firm of Joseph Roach and Sons, who were partnered with the Jewish merchant Aaron Lopez, who was Portuguese-born, were the most successful whale oil merchants in the British colonies. During this period, whale oil accounted for over 50% of all sterling earned by direct exports to Great Britain from the northern colonies. It was a major economic contributor to the British Crown and their sort of markets. The whaling fleet here in this town included 50 vessels. The village had all of the kind of supporting industries, including a rope work, spermaceti plant, distilleries, and shipyards. So as the revolution began to gain steam, it's important to realize that this area was deeply entrenched economically and also because of trade networks with the British. And the tensions that began to mount around especially importation and taxation would catch residents of this area up in the middle of the conflict. Now, one of those conflicts is probably one of the better known in the lead up to the American Revolution, and it has a local story, which I would imagine many of you are familiar with. But there's a thread that I want to kind of share that often is less well known. The Tea Act is enacted in 1773, and it's one of these main acts that is enacted to combat smuggling and also to kind of concretize the monopoly of the British East Indies Company, which really wanted to kind of build one distribution channel for tea into the American colonies. Tea was hugely important, especially socially within domestic households here in the colonies. And there was also a lot of smuggling happening from other countries, like the Dutch, who were kind of bringing tea in and skirting the British in taxation. So the British saw the Tax Act as an opportunity to consolidate the economic opportunity of importing tea to a community that was seeking it quite a lot. So what does that have to do with this area here? So in 1773, the Dartmouth was a vessel that was built in Bedford Village, right down here in the area. And in 1767, the Dartmouth was built in this area. And in 1773, it left London, loaded with 114 chests of East India tea, and arrived in Boston, docking at one of the wharves south on the southern edge of the city. The British required that the owner of the vessel sell the tea in the cargo hold within 30 days. Otherwise, he would start to be penalized. The Sons of Liberty, who had been fomenting and kind of agitating revolution, argued that the ship should be sent back with the tea still in the hold. They didn't want the tea here. They didn't want to have to pay the taxes. They wanted the ship owner to send it back. That ship owner was the Roach family, and the agent or the representative of that ship was the 23-year-old son of the scion of the family, Francis Roach. And Francis Roach, who you see in the miniature here, somewhat aged, is stuck in the middle. He's kind of between a rock and a hard place. The Sons of Liberty are saying, you can't unload this ship. The British are saying, you have to unload this ship. He has to go and plead his case to Governor Hutchinson, who's the British representative in Massachusetts. Hutchinson says, I'm not going to stand between you and the British. You have to sell this tea. As we all know, this culminates in the actions of December 16th, when the Sons of Liberty board the deck of the vessel and throw all the crates of tea into Boston Harbor. Francis, 4 months later, has to sail to London and explain what happened. A lesser-known part of the story underscores the broad experiences, though, of individuals in this period in Massachusetts. And it relates to another group of cargo in the hold of the Dartmouth on that fateful day in December of 1773. The Roach family were close friends with another Quaker family living in Boston, the Wheatleys. The famed poet Phyllis Wheatley, who had been kidnapped from West Africa at the age of 7 and enslaved in Boston by the Wheatley family, and who was named after the ship that transported her here, had learned to read and write in English, Latin, and Greek, no less. And her poems, which spoke about her world, including Harvard College and George Washington, gained a significant audience during the colonial period. The Wheatleys were a prominent Quaker family and well-connected to other families, including the Roach family. In fact, Benjamin Roach, another son, lived next door to the Wheatleys in Boston for a period. Her book of poems was published in London in 1773. And when the Wheatley family needed to find a shipper to bring them back to Boston, they turned to the Roach family and asked for help. They were shipped to Boston on the Dartmouth and sat safely boxed in the hold of the ship while the Tea Party unfolded on deck. How can we reconcile these experiences of enslavement with these acts of agitation and liberty-seeking as we look at the lead up to revolution? What contradictions lie in this historical event as the Sons of Liberty toss tea from the deck to agitate for fair representation? And why is this part of the story not more widely known? The Wheatleys did manumit Phyllis, but fame and fortune did not come with freedom, and she died at the young age of 31. Chapter 2, Defining the Bounds of Liberty. And I'm going to scoot through some of this because I think Lee is going to talk about it too. But no Massachusetts household was free from the economic systems that supported the British Empire. And those, of course, included the globalized economic system of slavery that grew up between 1620 and 1865. The economy revolved around trade between New England, which supplied food, fuel, lumber, and rum, and the South, which produced tobacco, coffee, sugar, indigo, rice, and cotton, and sent goods further south. By 1720, the Massachusetts population had over 200,000 enslaved people born in Africa or of African descent living in the area, including in this region here. Now, a number of developments during the period of revolution would lead to opportunities for freedom seekers. In 1776, 10 states wrote new constitutions that outlined the sort of rights of citizens within those territories. And we see the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts here, and I'm just pointing out the Declaration of Rights that was a part of that document that was written or drafted by John Adams. On the right, you see Elizabeth Freeman in a portrait. Elizabeth Freeman was one of a number of individuals, residents of Massachusetts, who were people of color and petitioned for their freedom after the Massachusetts State Constitution was passed in 1780. One of the other individuals that petitioned for freedom was the Dartmouth area Afro-Indigenous shipowner and merchant Paul Cuffey. I hope that name is familiar. Cuffey's story is extraordinary, and I'm going to touch on just one small part of it before moving on to the third part of what I want to talk about today. In 1780, Cuffey and a number of other regional residents brought a petition to the Massachusetts General Court, arguing that they should not be taxed because they did not have equal representation. And again, I think you'll hear more of this story in detail, but I do want to point out two fabulous quotes from one of the petitions that is preserved. And they say, the petition of several, they say, we being chiefly of the African extract, and by reason of long bondage and hard slavery, we have been deprived of enjoying the profits of our labor or the advantage of inheriting estates from our parents as our neighbors, the white people, do, having some of us not long enjoyed our freedom. That is an extraordinary quote in this document, articulating many of the same conversations we continue to have about generational inheritance and economic equity. Later on, they say, while we have not allowed the privilege of freemen of the state having no vote or influence in the election, yet many of our color have cheerfully entered the field of battle in the defense of the common cause, calling out the hypocrisy of those who drafted the Constitution, fighting for revolution and representation, while at the same time disenfranchising individuals within the state. So Cuffey's story is an extraordinary moment, this petition being a document that is a marker or landmark, I would say, in this moment. This petition was denied, but in 1783, the Supreme Court did determine that slavery was in direct conflict with the Constitution, legally ending it in the state. And in fact, Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice William Cushing said, slavery is, in my judgment, as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges in the Constitution, wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence. Now, of course, slavery was not legally abolished at the federal level in the United States until 1865, and the structures and supports that allowed it to exist in the first place, many of them still reside in different structures today. Chapter 3, the body of the people. Now, as the revolution unfolded around them, individuals in this region experienced its impact firsthand. In 1778, the British directly invaded this area and burned many of the wharves, dozens of private homes, and over 30 ships. In total, during the period of revolution, over 500 men enlisted and served for Dartmouth. No one was left unscathed from the conflicts. The stakes impacted individual lives and entire communities. And how people responded, especially when it came to their neighbors, reveals the impact the war had on folks who had little documentation elsewhere in the historical record. And one of the things we wanted to really focus on in the exhibition was to highlight the experiences of individuals from sort of working class backgrounds, those who may not exist in the sort of published histories or the stories, in order to consider what their lives might have been like. So there are about 36 individuals that are featured in the exhibit, but I've just pulled a couple here. The 4 along the top, these are all women, if you notice. The 4 along the top, these come from historical records or recountings of the American Revolutionary history here in the area. And there are some wonderful quotes in a couple of them. Mother Garish, who supposedly kept sweeping her floor as the British invaded and said, "If the enemy come to my house, they shall find it in good order." Or Deborah Doubleday, the widow who was operating the boarding house that was housing Continental soldiers, who, as the soldiers kept trying to burn down the boarding house, would put out the fire. And when the British soldiers said, "Aren't you afraid of us?" she said, you can see it here, she never saw a man she was afraid of. Now, these ones inject a little bit of humor to our understanding of the event. There's Betsy Tinkham, who was at a wedding and came back to find the invasion already underway. And she managed to get into a boat, but the boat was burnt and sunk. Finally, she found her way into the woods and hid with her neighbors. Many of the experiences, though, of individuals in the region, especially women who were from more disadvantaged backgrounds, who might have been widows, who might not have been husbands or other men in their lives, are extraordinarily sad. The economic impacts on this area were deep and devastating in many ways. And so women like Jane Shearman, who you see on the lower left, who was indentured as a child, experience Skiff, whose husband abandons her, and neighbors report that she needs assistance feeding her children. Or Esther Burgeon, who you see on the right, who likewise was indentured as a child to a local family. These indicate, I think, the experiences of residents of this region who we often encounter much less frequently. And it's worth noting that we don't have pictures of these individuals, we have written documents. And many of them are documents that are these individuals at their probably hardest moment, right? The worst moment that they experience. Take Sarah Strange, who was a widow, forced to give up her child in 1791. Less than 10 years after the conclusion of the war, because, quote, finding by experience that through the hardships of the times, it is impossible to support myself and child. Now, what I'm showing on the left is how we know about Sarah. And these are one of dozens of petitions to the Dartmouth, the regional selectmen, during this period from neighbors. These are people who see the hardship that others in their community are experiencing, and they speak up and they support their petition for help. So Sarah comes to the selectmen, and then all these people underneath sign their names and attest to her need for aid. Similarly, we have someone like Peter Blackmore, who in a document also submitted to the selectmen is described as a person non compos mentis, which means he probably was mentally disabled. And he had been indentured to Gideon Howland, where he was placed under a guardianship, essentially. It was described slightly differently. And neighbors write to the selectmen and say, Gideon is being paid half what he should be paid for the labor he's doing. He's working hard. He's doing a good job. If you don't encourage Gideon to pay him what he's owed, any one of us would take him onto our farm and pay him the right wage. And if you see how many names are on this list on both sides. In these documents from over 200 years ago, as I was working on this exhibition, I found myself continuously moved by this model of citizenship. In these documents, we see evidence of community and care for each other, care for our neighbors. And I think about what we can learn from these kinds of documents today if we look to these examples in the past. All right. So I'm going to leave us with that and hand it to the inestimable Lee Blake to carry us on this voyage in thinking about the promises of revolution. Lee, do you want me to put up Mumbet? Do you want me to? Keep that one up? Okay.
Well, what an act to follow. I mean, really. But I am going to do something that follows along about the whole idea of the unfinished project and the promises of the revolution by following people's lives and what they had to do to vote. And I like to talk about this because it's a wonderful period of time that the black communities fight, the women fight to vote all the way from 1776 to 1920, right? And those are the unfinished projects. And we're still dealing with voting rights now. So we have all this foundational information to talk about, but we can see the threads that have continued. So this week was also the time that the United States commemorated the birth of Martin Luther King. So it's a number of things just like kind of popped up while I was doing my research. One of the quotes that he uses quite frequently, or he used quite frequently, is the arc bends due to the word of righteous individuals. And this comes from Theodore Parker. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Theodore Parker, who was a Unitarian minister and an abolitionist, and how that quote comes down through the ages and to be something that Martin Luther King would say. I do not pretend, this is Theodore Parker, I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, my eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscious, and from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. January 29th, 1858. This is a speech that Theodore makes before the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Convention in 1858. Another quote that we'll talk a little bit about, I'm sure, and we saw it up here. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are, as you know, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And this was authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the foundational individuals who had almost 200 slaves. He fathered black children. He kept his mistress in a room that we know now, windowless, by his bedside. But he believed that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Of course, women weren't created equal, but of course, people of color were not created equal, and that never comes into their consciousness. This quote is the foundational idea of our country and of the revolution. Many of the signers of the revolution were slave owners. And you know, you've heard all those discussions, and of course now, with the federal government looking at all of the exhibits at the Smithsonian to correct them because, you know, they're not happy enough. We're going back to happy slaves again. Those quotes are not happy enough, and they're disappointed. The 19th century anti-slavery movement was the great social justice movement of our country. So while, yes, we're focusing on the revolution and the importance of our country moving away from a system of monarchy, moving to people coming together to plan their lives, plan their government, participate in their government if they were white and if they were men. I want to mention some of the men and women who pushed the arc of justice to justice. Many of the ideas of the revolution needed to be pushed. One of the things that Martin Luther King talks about when he talks about the quote, the arc of justice, is that doesn't mean that you sit around and wait for the arc of justice to come forward or to move. It means that it's your job to make the arc move towards justice. And he talks about that. It's not freedom and progressivism isn't something that's going to happen unless you make it happen. So he talks about that. So for his birthday, I will mention that. And I would like to talk about a few people. We're going to talk first about Elizabeth Mumbet. Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman. She was born in 1744 and dies in 1829. And essentially, she was an enslaved woman. She is from one of the counties in New York. And when she's about 14, she and her sister are given to a colonel, Colonel Ashley, who lives in Sheffield, Massachusetts. So that's how the story connects to Massachusetts. So she and her sister come to and live in Massachusetts. Colonel was a judge. He was active in the movement at the time to revolution and the Declaration of Independence. He actually writes something called the Sheffield Declaration in 1773. Another quote. "Mankind in a state of nature are free, equal, and have a right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives and their liberty." This clause that he writes becomes part of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780. Now, Ashley, Colonel Ashley, big wig in Sheffield, he's having all these parties. He's having people come over, men come over, they're discussing these brilliant ideas, this new republic, the revolution, and who's there but Bet? And what is Bet doing? Waiting on them. Bet is making their food. Bet is bringing their things to drink. And Bet says to herself, I'm no dummy. I know what they're talking about. But how come it doesn't relate to me? She is quoted saying that. So she says, there must be something that I can do to make these revolutionary ideas mine and to mean something to me. So Bet approaches Theodore Sedgwick. He's a lawyer, lives close by, and she knew he was an abolitionist, and the rest is history. She talks to him, and she says, I heard that paper read yesterday about the Sheffield. That says all men are created equal, and that every man has a right to freedom. I'm not a dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom? And that is her quote to Mr. Sedgwick. And he works with her, along with a few other lawyers, and they are able to get Elizabeth her freedom. And the first thing that she does is she stops using Mumbet as her name, and she takes Elizabeth Freeman as her name. Now, the three of us were just talking about sad stories, and I said, well, Elizabeth has a marvelous story, and it's a happy story. She is able to work Actually, she works for the Sedgwicks. She gets paid. She saves her money. She buys a home, and she's able to live to a ripe old age as a free woman, and she helps other people. She is a medicinal person. She is helping birth babies. She's doing domestic work, and she's getting paid for those things. And her family, her sister, and her other family members are able to live with her. She's one of the people who pushes the arc to make sure that women are free, in her case, and that she's pushing towards the arc for justice and voting rights. And along with other people, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about Cork Walker. Many of you may have never probably heard Cork Walker. In 1783, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled to abolish slavery. And that was because of the number of people from different parts of the state who come together and organize. And they're organizing separately. I don't want you to think there's this big group that says, we're going for voter rights. No, there were actions that individuals took to the courts through abolition lawyers, through discussions, and Cork Walker is one of them. In 2000, the Massachusetts State Legislature announced that they would celebrate Cork Walker by having Emancipation Day in Massachusetts. And that day is recognized for July 8th, 2000. So you see, first of all, you see all of these years go by and we recognize these people. And as an African-American historian that runs an organization that celebrates marginalized people, we see that all the time, generation after generation after generation, fighting for the rights to be free and to deal with the quotations that are written into our Constitution. So that's Mumbet. And we have Paul Cuffey, of course. I remember coming to the Whaling Museum maybe 12 years ago. We did our first Paul Cuffey conference because his 250th birthday was coming up. And I said, I'll be damned if his birthday comes up and we don't celebrate it. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about what an amazing man he was. So I'm going to leave all of his history for you to read because Amanda and Naomi have done so much work. And there are committees that worked on making sure that the papers and everything are digitized. And I first want to, Paul Cuffey was born 1759. He dies in 1817. He was the seventh child of Cuff Slocum and Ruth Moses. His father, Cuff, had been enslaved but was free by his owner, the Slocum family. So when you drive on Slocum Road in Dartmouth, that's who that road is. The Slocum family were slave owners. Now, one of the marvelous things about the Cuffey family is the Cuffey family is the best documented Afro-Indian family in the country, which means all of their papers, where I mentioned Cuff Slocum, his papers where he learns how to write when he is a free man and an adult are in this library. And the library, the Free Library, the New Bedford Free Public Library, all of their papers, many of the individuals who come after and write about Cuffey's biography, the family biography, the papers that they used to do their research and their archival work is here. It's here in this museum, and it's in here also at the public library, digitized. At different times, I see some of the staff that I work with at the Center for Education at UMass. We would pull out the digital copies and bring them to the children, so children could see that adults were learning how to read and write, just like they were when they were enslaved. So it became a great learning tool for me to use the papers. So you know that they're documented now, you know where the documents are, you can go and look at those things. But Paul was a mariner, sailing, whaling, coastal shipping, and together, he also decides that it's time for him to be able to vote. He wanted to own land. He wanted his kids to go to school. Schools in Westport were segregated, so he has to put his money and do that. But what essentially happens is when he's about 19, he and his brother, John is 23, the two of them come together and they petition the state for the right to vote. They petition the state first as African Americans, and that is turned down. So then they petition the state again as Native Americans, and that's turned down. And then they say, aren't you focused on no taxation without representation? We're owners of boats, we're owners of marinas, we own land, and we're being taxed. And here we are asking you to allow us to vote. So the state just turns their application down. But essentially what happens is it starts the conversation again. What should happen? What should happen? And eventually, in 1783, the Constitution adds that language that allows people who own property to vote. Now, just another leap. Frederick Douglass comes to New Bedford, as many of you know, in 1883. He's voting in New Bedford in 1841. So he comes in 3 years. He is able to work on the docks, become a lecturer, and in 1841, he's voting because he pays his poll tax. So the issue really was money and being able to vote because you owned property or you paid a poll tax, not because you were not white. So he's able to do that. So we have all these wonderful stories, and of course now we have Abolition Row Park, we have a statue of Douglass, and that's only maybe 3 years old. But it's the whole idea that you have people who are involved in historical preservation, who are involved in keeping the stories going and making sure that some of the truth of the issues that we've all dealt with are being told. One other group I wanted to mention were the Eastons, and I know there are some descendants of the Easton family here. Caesar Easton, James Easton, there were a number of Eastons. They lived in Middleborough, Brockton area. They did not live in New Bedford proper. And of course, all those towns kind of smoothed together in a funny way. But they are living in the 1780s in that area, and even earlier because they are living on Indian reservations even before then. But part of their issue was that they were free, they were educated. Caesar Easton fought as a soldier in the Revolutionary War under George Washington's command. When his 3 years of service was over, he and his family returned to Middleborough, where they suffered marginalization and indignities every day. When the free African Americans who resided in English colonial towns, they were constantly reminded that they would not be considered equal with even the lowest class of whites. Often they were subjected to the same restrictive black codes as enslaved black people. They could not vote. They could not own property. They could not have certain kinds of property, like they couldn't own pigs. They couldn't own canes. Unless they couldn't walk, then they could have a cane. But you couldn't have a cane in case you had to protect yourself from some white man who was going to beat your ass. So those are things that they had to deal with. And their family pulled together educational institutions that trained young men at the time with industrial skills, carpentry, plumbing, things that were needed, because their children and the children of other free black people were kept out of the educational field. So they do these kinds of programs. And one of the individuals, Hosea Easton, was a great abolitionist, wrote amazing tracts, and spoke at a lot of churches trying to drum up the empathy that free African Americans should have after the revolution. So those three I'd like you to know, and then I'm going to go to one last person, Elizabeth Piper Ensley. Elizabeth Piper Ensley's birthday was this week, and the Massachusetts Women's Center out of Boston sent a notice around on Facebook, which they do, congratulating her. Elizabeth Piper Ensley is one of the few suffrage women from Massachusetts. She fought for the right for women to vote and was able, through her own personal work, she got a wonderful education here in New Bedford, and then she moved to Boston. She moved to Howard University, Washington, D.C. She was one of the women, and there are several from this area, that helped found Washington, Howard University. And her and her husband, actually, he was enslaved. They moved to Colorado. And when they moved to Colorado, after the experiences of being at Howard and Washington and here, what they do is that they organize the men and women in Denver, Colorado, and Elizabeth is credited with helping the women get the vote before women get the vote in the nation. So all of those people bend the arc. They bend the arc. They're the progressives who push. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It is a privilege to get to share work with you. This is one of my favorite museums in the country. Yeah, it's a really good one. And it does something that I think other museums, especially museums that are dealing with whaling, sort of struggle with, which is to situate the industrialization of whaling in time, like within American history, alongside not just moments like the Revolution, but also the attempted near genocide of Native Americans, the transatlantic slave trade. It does that without flinching. It just says this, and it feels like in some ways like very Massachusetts, like this is what it was, you know, and then we deal with it. And so I'm gonna read 4 poems because that's what I know how to do. And this poem, the first poem that I'll read, I wrote for tonight, and it's very new, so I feel a little bit nervous, but I think it'll be okay. And you'll hear a lot of the language that you will hear language from the Declaration of Independence in the poem. And the title of the poem is also the first line of the poem. So this is titled The Pursuit of Happiness. The pursuit of happiness, as written in oak gall ink, always had blood on its hands. I could stop there. Admit nothing I say could tune us better to the rot in the root, in the foundation. Self-evident the lie, all men did not include all men. Man so narrowly defined as to confound. Can you define a man? Know him by his wig and stocking, his acres, and elegant white hand that wields the pen, the sword, the whip. I could stop there. Say, this is the problem with living past the end of your myth, though this myth never could keep its legs under it. I'm mixing my metaphors, no image large enough to hold 250 years of dissonance and contradiction. I practice humility. Turn to the whale, what's left of them, those who have returned, those who are trying. I first felt them my kin in these halls, both our families made capital, hunted and hauled by the same ships, cargo in the golden age. Our bones and blood and fat as much bedrock as any document. What then of liberty and life? Having made a way out of no way, we are used to flourishing deep. Who am I speaking to and of? Us, of course, who know fear when the rope comes out. Memories lashed into our backs, bashed into our mouths, the state bloody as it ever was, but we're still here. Let us be grateful then that this is neither the end nor the height, but a series of days entered into the ledger. Let us review what came before, which shows us that we are not now as we have been, that we have never lived up to our old proclamations, but inched in increments ever closer. Still there resides in us, in the face of repeated injuries and usurpation, a will to aspire, to outlive tyranny and its aftermath, a future we, none of us, may ever see. So this next poem was written as a part of an anthology called 400 Souls, the Ibram Kendi edited anthology. And poets were tasked with writing, I think, about 2 decades. And I got the decades 1820 to 1840. And so I started with the Missouri Compromise, which is where Missouri wanted to be a slave state, and even though it was no longer really a thing. And so then Congress had to figure out how to navigate that to keep the balance in Congress. And I'll just big air quotes. It's like, what are we balancing? And so at the same time that Missouri enters the Union as a slave state, Maine enters as a non-slave state. And at the end of that window of time that I was given to write about, Oregon comes into the Union, and it has to decide whether or not it will be a slave state. And it decides that it will not be, but also that it will not tolerate the presence of free Black people. So, you know. The West. Other moments mentioned in here also include I won't use this term, but the man who discovered, the doctor who experimented on enslaved women, and eventually found the technique that would close fistulas, vaginal fistulas. And I think that's all you need to. I mean, there's a lot in here, so. Okay. Compromise. 1. They tied it to the land like a dog, the idea, compromise, which the land alone is incapable of exacting, absent on the one white hand, the North, and on the other white hand, the South. Incapable, absent the parchment declarations and debate, all of which alongside the hoe and shovel, the plow, the whip, broke the land open like skin, a latitude welled with blood. 3. Say the compromise is between a woman who feels pain and another woman who feels pain. Say both women are torn after giving birth, and from both arise a smell like rot, a pain from being rotted inside. Say fistula. Say only one woman is whole. Say the other is 3/5. Which one do you sow with silver, with pig gut, with lead? Whoever says, sows. Whoever's sown gets no laudanum. Say cure. Call it technique. Call it science. Whoever calls it keeps it, no matter Anarcha who took, after 30 procedures, the needle and silk. A new compromise. Take down the statue, hooded and noosed, put into storage, concede, still only one woman is whole. 4. Concede in favor of balance. Let the state petition for statehood. Let the state say who is free. Let the state enslave. Let the state set the terms for enslavement. 3 years, the Lash Law. Let the state set the clock for exile once the term is complete. Let the state call it grace, 3 years for women, 2 years for men. Let the state refuse to ratify the amendments, 14th and 15th. Let the state Jim Crow before Jim Crow, whites only on every border. Let the state keep its balance in 1959 and 73, on campus in 1988, or on the light rail in 2017. A bat in its hand, a knife in its hand, blood on its hand. 5. They set the terms, rigged the clock, the ship, colonized the land. They would see us free but gone, compromise. But we convened, decided the land that held our blood, our kin, decided we would stay, show that one way could be another. 6. Track the fissure of the first compromise, then the second, then another running fugitive through the foundation. Follow it 1 century to my great-grandmother's birth, a century more just past her death. It wasn't that long ago I was sitting on her porch swing, hoping for a breeze. It wasn't that long ago we were in the 24th state, our bodies undoing the roads. It wasn't that long ago the latitude migrated, anchored to the southern border, history looped. This isn't America. It's nothing else. Okay, so 2 more. I saw this sticker in a park in Seattle. The sticker said, "We came here to get away from you." And I thought that's a good title for a poem. So one of the things that often happens when I'm in a museum space as a Black American, especially if it's like a natural history museum, I don't know like what there's like a very specific thing that happens, but it's like people start talking to me, white people start talking to me about race, even if that's not what I came for. So that's what this poem is. We came here to get away from you. Port Townsend, Washington. Downhill, a skeleton of an orca suspended, a female beached, belly full at that time of seal and fish, the seal and fish full at that time of poison. The volunteer, white bob, soft face, knew too the desire to see a body, its echoes suspended. Hope, the name given to a dead whale once located by clicks and whistles and echo and inlet and open sea. The volunteer tells me she visited the National Museum of African American History and Culture, says, the saddest part to me, the Emmett Till, do you know him? Exhibit. The whale killer weakened by a scaffold of old poison, DDT, PCBs, which no prey can process but holds in its fats, its tissues, its soft parts. See her southern scaffold, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. See, I hadn't thought to think of him here under the reconstructed skeleton I had come to see and once seen to mourn. She wanted to stand over his bones, his grave on her bucket list. She pushed into me her desire, the sound surfacing what had long ago leached into my softest parts. I wanted to hold her shoulders, vomit into her mouth this water full of dead or dying, to fill her with a little knowing, change her, heavy her, let the knowing wash her into the Salish at low tide, past driftwood and eelgrass, hope a warning at her back. Can I just say, I think it's wild to name a beach, the skeleton of a beached orca, Hope. I think that's like I felt very confused in that space. Because she died, you know? What are we hoping? This is the last poem. So a lot of these do end up, a lot of this poem takes place in Oregon. I'll just read it. Thank you so much for your good attention. And I'm just so grateful to have been invited tonight. On the occasion of a juvenile humpback killed by boat strike and beached near Nehalem. Our hunger for a body dead so large as to fascinate. Let us see it, touch it, let the dogs smell it, walk on it, its deflated pleats, its barnacles on the fluke. Please don't touch it, but we do. How could we not take a picture? The whale's body background to our smiling faces. This whale whose body should be feast for condors, brown bears, black. But for us, we disrupt, we threaten, careless even of the western snowy plovers nesting nearby. Maria tells me they plan to carry the body out to open sea. Let the body become its own repast, feeding as it falls, pelagic, abyss, hadal. I will not make metaphor out of this death, which stands for itself. A male juvenile humpback killed by boat strike. Only sometimes we scavenge and call it witness. Sometimes we witness and see open the white mouth of empire, to which this death also belongs. Thank y'all so much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Another round of applause for Lee, Donika, and Naomi. Thank you. What a treat. What a treat. All great things must come to an end at one point, but we certainly have room for maybe a question or two. What I want to do is move it along a little bit because a couple things. I want to make sure you see our exhibition, and we do have some light refreshments, and the caterers will not stay here all night. So we want to make sure you get a little something. My mother always said never stand between folks and a drink and some food. So is there any one question or two questions? We might have just a little bit of time for that. I will also say that Donika will also be signing copies of her works, which are extraordinary. Naomi, Lee, they will all be at the reception as well, so you can certainly seek them out. But if there is a question here anyone has, we can entertain it.
Yes, hi. Milt Dunlop, grew up in Fall River. And then I was in the military back in the 70s in Georgia. And when I got there, I realized that the Bill of Rights didn't really apply to everyone. And it was really an awakening for me. So my point is, over the last 40 years or so, I thought we made a lot of progress towards the Bill of Rights. But recently, in the last decade, especially the last 12 months, I think we're going backwards. It seems like we need to erect the ship. How do we go about that? Anyone from the panel?
Well, jeez. That's a light question there. I mean, I'm sure it's on everyone's minds. But yeah, Naomi, you want to take that one?
Well, I can reflect on it a little bit because we were walking around in the galleries earlier, and I think, what you said sort of struck me. We were talking about, it is hard to kind of see progress when you're in a moment that feels so, where the past feels like it's kind of swallowing you up, not to paraphrase you. But one of the things that struck me was the kind of ways in which this museum, in some ways, the histories, the stories that have been shared tonight, all of them demonstrate extraordinary perseverance and steadfastness and hope and survival in the face of incredibly challenging circumstances. And so I think, if anything, maybe we can take heart from the lessons of the lives that we've learned a little bit about and continue to learn about. How's that? Anyone?
So I appreciate that question very much. And it goes right to some of the work that I do, reclaiming history and making sure people don't forget what happened in the past. And I come before you as someone who taught African American studies at the local high school, New Bedford High School, many, many years ago. But I also founded the New Bedford Women's Center 50 years ago. So as women, we have to be really careful, because the people who are in office now would like us to go back 50 years. And women are not going to go back. Getting underpaid, and your comments about the issues around women's health, because the Women's Center started as a health center. Every time you turn around, there is another drug that women who are pregnant need, or women need, that they want to take off the market. You cannot let them do that. You have to push against that. So I'm appreciative of your comment, because I do feel that we're being dragged back, and I'm not going to let them.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I'm
Remember
gonna,
the ladies.
Yeah.
Lee, what am I supposed to add after that? I mean, the thing that I think most often is that part of the narrative, we are in a time in which it is difficult to connect with one another and to reach across difference, right? We see each other as distinct. There is a narrative of scarcity that pervades the national conversation. Someone will get more than I have. Even if I have a lot, someone might get more than me, right? Or we need someone on the bottom. I mean, we don't talk about that as being a part of the narrative, but it is very important to, I think, the American ideological practice, is that there has to be someone on the bottom. And I don't think we will ever go back as far as some people would like. But I think the way that it changes is that we see how we're connected to each other. We see how one group struggle is our struggle. Part of the issue with one of the many issues, but one of the big issues with the Declaration of Independence is like the narrowness of that definition. If we can say that some people are not human, and that is built in to the national identity. Some people in this country are not understood to be fully human. It is okay to discriminate against them. That is a human practice, I would say, but it is a deeply American practice. And when we concede ground, or when we cede ground, like, oh, well, they're talking about trans women, they're talking about trans girls, that's okay. It's like at any point we say any of that's okay, we've lost the game. Right? Like, we have to be connected to the most vulnerable around us. And if we are not, then I think that's where the loss happens. It's where we fracture. It's where we're vulnerable. We're stronger together. Right? So, not as eloquent as Lee, but.
No, Donika, that was great. Thank you. And I'll jump in. I am not a historian or an educator or nearly as qualified as these three right here, but what I'm going to do is lean into the power of museums, because in order to make change for tomorrow, you have to understand yesterday. And that is what we are about here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It is what Lee is about at the New Bedford Historical Society. And you build empathy through knowledge and being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And Naomi and her team do an extraordinary job with our exhibits, bringing life and narratives through material culture. So go to a museum and drag your friends and neighbors along. So thank you so much. Enjoy the reception and enjoy the show.